All right, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vera Ceselski, and I'm the site manager here in Durham, North Carolina for Stagville State Historic Site, one of the sister sites in our network of state historic sites, along with Bennett Place, who are hosting our online event today. Um, the site where I work here in North Durham County, Stagville is formerly the site of one of the largest plantation complexes anywhere in North Carolina, and really one of the largest, one of the best documented sites of slavery anywhere here in the state of North Carolina. By 1865, the plantation that we call Stagville today was controlled by the Benahan, Cameron, and Mordecai families, three wealthy white landowning and slaveholding families. And those families controlled about 50 square miles of land around a huge swath of Durham County, as well as parts of Wake and Granville and Orange counties around us. But most importantly, the history that we document here is about the stories of the people who were forced to endure slavery on this site. So in 1865, we believe that there were somewhere between 900 and 1,000 individuals who were living in bondage on this land. And our work today focuses on researching and teaching about the stories of the families who endured slavery here, and then understanding the stories and the history of their descendants long after emancipation, in some cases following them all the way up to the present day here in Piedmont, North Carolina. Um, this afternoon, during this program, I'm going to be talking with you a little bit about how we can better understand maybe some of the impacts of the surrender at Bennett Place on the lives of enslaved people here in this part of North Carolina. Obviously, my expertise is in following the history of emancipation for the families who were enslaved here at Stagville. So I hope by sharing a few stories about how particular enslaved families at Stagville experienced emancipation, that this will give you a window into some of the dangers, some of the choices, some of the celebrations, and some of the hopes and opportunities that were in front of freed people as the Confederate surrender at Bennett Place played out. I'll be sharing with you examples of stories from kind of throughout the spring and summer and into the early fall of 1865. Again, obviously, these are stories of one group of families in one particular place on one particular plantation. But I think part of the power of Stagville's history and of the records and documents we have here is that the history of this place can be a window into understanding the experiences of enslaved and freed people all across North Carolina, and certainly all across what is now Durham County. At the end of my talk today, once I share with you a few of these stories and documents that we've uncovered that give us a glimpse into how the surrender, how this moment of emancipation actually affected enslaved families, at the end of my program, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ways that freed people in this part of North Carolina celebrated and remembered the moment of emancipation, and share with you a little bit how that connects to celebrations of Juneteenth and the national movement today to honor and recognize the history of emancipation with holidays and celebrations and commemoration all the way up to the present day. But I'll start by talking about the moment of freedom, or the many moments of freedom as they played out here in Durham County in 1865. Here at Stagville, we believe that freed families, these hundreds of people who've been held in bondage here, began to experience freedom sometime early in the spring of 1865, perhaps around this time of year in March and April, as United States troops began to move into this area, and as for the first time with those troops, the Emancipation Proclamation began to be enforced in this part of the state. The first thing that stands out from the surviving narratives of enslaved people from this part of the state, from these weeks and days, is that this was in many cases a time of great danger for formerly enslaved people. That danger showed up in several different ways. We have surviving accounts from the WPA Slave Narratives collection, oral histories that were taken with formerly enslaved people during the Great Depression, often with people who had been very young children during this history, during emancipation. And we know from some of those surviving narratives in this area that enslaved people and freed people began to encounter the large numbers of soldiers and troops that were moving through this area. It was common for freed people in this part of North Carolina to encounter both United States and Confederate troops in the time leading up to the surrender and immediately after the surrender at Bennett Place. And we see glimpses in these narratives of how dangerous or how fraught and tense these encounters could be. A young boy who was here at Stagville, Abner Jordan, remembers his mother, Ella, being threatened by federal troops who were seeking to raid supplies and luxuries from the households of the Cameron family, the slaveholders on this plantation. Abner remembered all his life that Ella had been held at gunpoint and ordered to reveal the location of the Cameron family riches by these soldiers. She told the men that she did not know the location of any of the things that they were seeking, and she told them that she would not lie to them even to save her life. Somehow she was able to fortunately escape with her life from this dangerous moment. Just up the road from Stagville on the cane plantation closer to Hillsborough, a young woman named Sarah Deborah remembered encountering Confederate soldiers who held men in her family at gunpoint and asked them if they wanted to be free. They killed any man who dared to say yes to that question. And Sarah Deborah remembered that 3 of her uncles were killed by Confederate soldiers in this way. These stories give us a glimpse of the way that these last weeks of the war often meant danger for enslaved people that were caught between or among troops searching for resources or seeking to deny freedom to freed people. We also know that freed people faced dangers here from the overseers and the slaveholders, people who were seeking to re-exert control over freed people and land here, seeking to deny freed people full freedom. And we have surviving letters from the Stagville area where Samuel Piper, a white overseer who was enslaved here, who was charged with controlling enslaved people here, remembers how he writes one month that year and says that here at Stagville, things were on the verge of armed conflict. He reports, "I am armed and so are they," referring to the freed people. So we get a sense that freed people here have taken up arms in self-defense to defend themselves and their families and to push back against overseers or people who might try to force them to labor here as they had during slavery. So I hope those stories can give you some sense of some of the conflict and tension, of course, of any place in wartime, but certainly with what freed people were experiencing here. The last story that I want to share along those lines gives us a glimpse, not of violent conflict, but of some of the ways that even freed people here who encountered troops at Stagville weren't necessarily treated as equal, and the way that freed families here began to see a freedom placed in front of them, but not always a guarantee that that freedom would include a measure of full equality or full voice in their communities. So this story comes from, again, from a WPA narrative, from a young boy who was growing up here at Stagville in 1865. Cy Hart's parents were a couple named Ephraim and Nellie, who'd been purchased and brought to this plantation and forced to labor here for much of their lives. Cy testified later in his life that even though he was probably only maybe 6 years old at the time, Cy always later in his life remembered the moment where he had met federal troops here at Stagville and been told for the first time that he was free and that he could leave this place. He remembered that those federal troops broke open food supplies on the plantation, but tellingly in this story, he does not remember sitting down to eat, hungry as well, alongside these men. He remembers that these federal soldiers ordered his mother Nellie, who had been a cook on this plantation, to cook for them, to serve them first, and that Cy and his mother were only allowed to eat after the soldiers themselves had finished. They were only left with what was left. So we see a clear image of Nellie, of men and women like her, not having a full seat at that table in that moment of freedom. So the second thing I want to talk about in terms of stories that we can follow that freed people experienced here at Stagville is celebration. And when we talk about emancipation, we start to see some little glimpses of the ways that freed people celebrated and claimed this freedom for themselves in the spring and summer of 1865. Often we don't have surviving detailed accounts of what these celebrations look like here at Stagville or here in Durham County, but we can see glimpses of it in some of the surviving slave narratives. So for example, we have a surviving autobiography from a man named Morgan Latta, who was born into slavery on the Cameron plantations. He actually was forced to live in a set of slave quarters that were south on the southern sections of this plantation on the edge of Wake County. And Morgan remembered that when he and his family and the other people in the slave dwellings where they were living heard for the first time that the Confederacy had begun to surrender, they knew that their liberation, that their emancipation would be coming. And in his autobiography, he remembers what he called the shouts that echoed between enslaved people across the portion of that site as they proclaimed their joy and proclaimed this moment of freedom. Morgan specifically remembers in that moment how important Christian faith traditions had been for his family to find hope and to survive the institution of slavery. And he remembers hearing people in his community, in his family say, finally, we have been praying for 30, for 40 years, and God has brought about the end of slavery. Finally, we have been praying and we are free and abolition has come. So we get a moment of real joyful noise and celebration in that scene. We also have a few surviving letters from the summer of 1865 that describe enslaved people feasting for the first time on the rich food stocks of this plantation, which had been denied to them for so many years throughout the history of slavery. We see glimpses of enslaved people butchering livestock, feeding themselves and their families freely from the farms and orchards and livestock of this land, which they had labored for generations to build and maintain, but usually had never been permitted to have free access to, or in some cases, perhaps any access to at all. We also know that in the summer of 1865, the Cameron family who owned Stagville wrote derisively that enslaved people were holding what they called a carnival along the riverbanks in this area. We don't know exactly what that scene looked like, but it's a powerful moment to imagine here of joy and celebration that gives us a glimpse of how enslaved people might have been gathering together freely for the first time outside of the bonds of slavery and finding ways to celebrate and share together and perhaps organize and dream together about what this freedom was going to be, about how they could perhaps make this freedom more real by finding ways to ensure that their freedom would include perhaps voting rights, full citizenship, political rights, education, land ownership, family reunion, all the things that freed people hungered for to see as part of the justice of emancipation in 1865. I want to touch on a few of the other things that we know that enslaved people, freed people, were hungry for that year. We have a few glimpses of how people in this area began to organize for land ownership following the surrender at Bennett Place. One of the first things that many freed people recognized was that to stabilize and secure their freedom, they needed access to economic opportunity and economic freedoms. Many of them had labored for years in agricultural systems on plantations and farms across the Piedmont, and they recognized that land ownership and the ability to have and work land of their own was a critical part to securing a safe and stable community for them and their families going forward in freedom. Here at Stagville, many freed people stayed on this land, and perhaps they stayed on this land initially because they hoped to occupy it and claim it as their own, or find a path to land ownership here to purchase some of this property. We know that, again, the Cameron family wrote derisively about the freed people's hopes for land ownership here. They were terrified that freed people might get access to substantive portions of their land. And they were determined that emancipation would not include some avenue to redistribution of land here on this plantation. We do know, however, that by early spring and summer of 1865, a freedman named Jesse Ruffin, who had been formerly enslaved by the Ruffin family in this area, was organizing freed people together. The Camerons describe that Jesse was leading freed people to have, quote, demands and exactions, expectations and hopes. Included in those hopes was a desire for what the Cameron family called a freehold interest in the soil on which they reside, which tells us that freed people were organizing here around the idea not just of owning land, but owning specifically this land. The last thing I want to touch on in terms of how enslaved people here in this part of the state experienced emancipation following the surrender at Bennett Place is that we see a tremendous desire among families who've been freed here to try to repair some of the harms that had been done to them during slavery by trying to reunite and re-find family members who had been stolen and sold and separated away from them. We have a few glimpses of what that looked like for people here on the ground. Again, I turn to Morgan Latta's narrative. He described those shouts, that moment of celebration and of great faith and great certainty. But he also describes a moment of hope and fear and uncertainty in his experience of emancipation. Morgan writes in his autobiography that when he learned of the Confederate surrender, he gathered with other enslaved people in his community as a young child, and that many of the families in his community met together at night that evening and had a prayer service together in the dark of their houses. And he says that at that prayer service, they prayed together that God would restore the family who had been stolen from them back to them. In his book, Morgan writes and says, husbands prayed that they would see their wives again, and wives prayed that they would see their husbands again, and children prayed that their parents would be brought back to them and their brothers and sisters as well. He gives us a sense of the big questions that freed people were asking during these days, wondering if the people who they had lost would be able to be found again. Morgan lived on a section of this plantation from which dozens of enslaved people had been sold in the decade before 1865. We know that at least one of the families who was sold off of this plantation before 1865, a young couple named Elijah and Lucy with their 6 children, attempted to, for the first time, be able to freely travel and come back to this place in the wake of the Confederate surrender. The Cameron family received word from other white landowners in North Carolina that although Elijah and Lucy had been sold away from this site in 1859, in the summer of 1865, we have surviving reports that Elijah and Lucy were walking back from eastern North Carolina where they had been sold, trying to get to Stagville with their 6 children, all very young, with no resources, with no money, with very few supplies, hoping that they could walk all this distance across the state, probably to get back to their parents, their grandparents, their kin who were here on this land. And so we can imagine the families here at Stagville and across Durham County talking together, strategizing together about how to find people who had been sold or separated away from them. And we think it's possible that some of the families that stayed in place on this plantation land for so long after emancipation may have stayed here at first because people had been taken away from them. And they might have believed that by staying here, they could perhaps provide an anchor point for people to come back and find them yet again. We don't know if Elijah and Lucy ever made it here back to Durham County. We know that when the Camerons received word that Elijah and Lucy were returning they seemed to perceive this young family walking impoverished across North Carolina as a threat. And Paul Cameron recommended that guards be posted against them so that they would not be able to enter this land. We have yet to find any documents that tell us if Elijah and Lucy were able to make it here, whether they were able to find their family that were here again, and what kind of dangers they faced if they did arrive at this place and face resistance from the Camerons. I hope that these stories can give us a sense of how the broader arc of the end of the war, the surrenders at Bennett Place, the movement of Federal and Confederate troops through this area deeply affected enslaved people in this part of North Carolina. And I hope these stories can give you a sense of the way that enslaved people were facing not just a new birth of freedom, but immediately new questions, new conflicts for themselves about how to claim that freedom, how to make that freedom real, how to celebrate that freedom, and how to face the conflicts, the tension and dangers, the deep need for land ownership and the deep need to have family restored to them that they saw as integral pieces of making this new freedom for themselves here. I want to touch briefly on the ways that emancipation has been celebrated throughout this history. What we see in the historical record is that really from the moment of 1865, some form of public celebration and recognition of Juneteenth or Emancipation Day or Jubilee Day or Freedom Day has been a part of the history of communities all across the United States. Here in North Carolina, we have surviving reports of celebrations like this, as I said, beginning in 1865. If you're familiar with any celebration like this today, you probably have heard perhaps of Juneteenth, which is the most nationally recognized, the most widely known of these emancipation celebrations. But it's actually only fairly recently that Juneteenth has become a more widely known and widely celebrated marker. It is probably today the best known of the national or local days that are used to remember emancipation. Here in North Carolina, newspaper accounts tell us that freed people did not celebrate emancipation. Communities across North Carolina usually did not celebrate emancipation in June. Instead, we see accounts of communities across North Carolina that celebrated what they called Emancipation Day, which would have been on January 1st to mark the date in January 1st, 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation first came into effect. We also see communities in North Carolina, especially African-American communities in North Carolina, claim July 4th as a day to mark independence. They took up a national day of independence associated with the founding of this country and celebrated it as a day for African-American communities to remember the time so much later in this country's history when those freedoms first began to be fully extended to them. And so even in the summer of 1865, we know that in this area, freed people from Durham County and Wake County and the surrounding area flooded into Raleigh for a massive parade led by Black leaders and organizers and religious figures to celebrate July 4th, 1865, as a celebration of the United States more broadly, but also specifically as a celebration of emancipation. The surviving newspaper accounts of that day describe freed people of all ages filling the streets of Raleigh in a massive parade to celebrate together that this day was now a day that meant freedom for them as well for the first time. Maybe most movingly from those accounts, they describe a parade of thousands of freed people in the streets, waving American flags, carrying banners that said, "Now no slave lives beneath this flag." Right? Other days that have been celebrated across the history of emancipation include dates in December, like December 6th, to mark the passage of the 13th Amendment and the constitutional abolition of slavery in this country, as well as Juneteenth, right? The most famous of these, which originated tracing all the way back to 1865 and 1866 in Texas, but for a long time was a regional holiday and a holiday associated with the specific history of emancipation, the specific history of the slow trickle of news out into the western edges of Confederate territory as freed people in parts of Texas learned on June 19th, 1865, finally, of the news of emancipation. But with the passage of time, Juneteenth has been spread to communities all across this country. And today here in Durham, we have a fantastic North Carolina celebration of Juneteenth in the city of Durham, which has been happening for about 15 or 16 years now. And here at Stagville, we've been commemorating Juneteenth as the day to recognize emancipation and the legacies of slavery and the history of this particular freedom at our site for about almost 15 years now as well. So even though we know that June 19th, 1865 was not a date that probably was any kind of turning point for the people who were enslaved here at Stagville, we recognize the broader movement to celebrate Juneteenth, to lift up the history of emancipation, and Stagville has adopted Juneteenth, June 19th, as an appropriate and right day to recognize this history and to remember the people who endured slavery here and who actually lived through those months of emancipation here. That's the primary history that I have to share with you all today. I would be very happy to welcome anyone who heard this presentation to our site, to Stagville State Historic Site, to join us for one of our tours or programs, which include deeper dives into parts of this history. And you're also always welcome to email our staff if you have any questions about anything that was in the presentation today. We'd be happy to follow up with you and try to answer any questions that we can, since we couldn't be live together in person today. If you'd like to send us an email with any questions, or if you're interested to learn more about anything that I shared today, you can email our staff here at Stagville at info@stagville.org. And I'll be sure to share that information with the staff of Bennett Place as well, so they can direct you our way if need be. Thank you so much for including me in the events to remember this important week in Bennett Place's history. And I hope to see you all at Stagville sometime soon.